Hi, this morning we have the opportunity to talk with Michael Lee of the Brennan Center. Michael is a senior counsel with a democracy program at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. The Brennan Center has produced independent research on what causes gerrymandering, where it's happening, how to measure it, and what its impact is on our political system. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. I'd like to talk about what you found with your research on the 2010 map since we're getting ready for the 2020 cycle. I was especially interested in the research that you did in producing your report, The Extreme Maps from 2017. Do you mind just walking us briefly through, the research that you did to produce that report?
Sure. Gerrymandering, first, a little bit about what gerrymandering is and what it isn't, more importantly, what it is, because it's a big catch-all term that we use in the United States to describe political manipulation of maps. And that includes a lot of things. It includes, drawing a seat so your brother-in-law can win election to Congress. It means drawing a map so that you can punish an opponent or somebody who you don't want to win office. It also can mean grabbing a disproportionately large share of seats and locking in that advantage. And it's that latter one that that has been at the heart of litigation over gerrymandering the last few years. And the allegation, to put it in more simple terms, is that a party, and it's almost always something that occurs when one party has control of all of the levers of power, when a party decides that it's going to draw the maps so that it gets an unfair share of seats, given the statewide vote and what you normally would expect with fairly drawn maps, and then designs the districts in a way that they never become competitive, and that a party can't, even if it wins significantly more votes, it doesn't win more seats. And so that's the sort of extreme gerrymandering that we looked at in our report called Extreme Maps. And what we did is we looked at the maps that were drawn after the 2010 census using three different metrics. And there are additional metrics that you could use, but we used three of the most common and widely cited ones. And what we found was that it's really a handful of there is significant bias in the maps, but it's really a handful of states that are driving the bias on the maps, and that's really and it's states that you might not expect in some ways, because they are states that are the battleground states like Michigan or Pennsylvania or North Carolina, states that are fairly close to 50-50 and yet have outsized advantages for one party or another. So, for example, in Michigan, it's a Republicans have 9 out of the 14 of the seats, and it's even worse in like North Carolina, where Republicans currently hold 10 out of the 13 seats in a state that is very much 50-50. Pennsylvania used to have a 13-5 advantage. The maps were redrawn as a result of court litigation, which we can talk about later. But in the first 3 elections of this decade, it's been a 13-5 advantage for Republicans. And what we found is that regardless of the measure that you use, and there's a lot of sort of debate about which measure is better or worse, or which one better captures the problem. The reality is that they all tend to point in the same direction of the same handful of states.
Thanks. So what about the response that, well, these maps, they could sort of happen by chance?
Well, that's a common argument that you get, or I should say used to get. I think you're seeing it used less frequently now. But oftentimes people will say, well, it's just because Democrats live in places like Detroit or like New York City. And the reality is that, if you look at the states that have the worst bias, sort of the most durable bias, it's states, again, that are very much 50-50 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, North Carolina. These are states that if you looked at a precinct level map or a census block level map, you would see a lot of light pink and a lot of light blue across the map. These are not states, in other words, that are like Nebraska, where other than a few pockets of blue, it's dark red, right? If all of these states were sort of dark red across, you wouldn't really have to gerrymander, right? Because you would just any district, no matter what shape or what configuration, or whether you drew it to the east or the west, would be exactly the same because they're so dark red. But that's not the case in states like Michigan or North Carolina, where you see a lot of pink and blue sprinkled in among each other, which indicates that they're even outside of the big cities. There's a lot of people of there's a lot of mixed partisanship, people, Democrats living close to Republicans, and in those instances, how you slice and dice and recombine voters actually makes a huge degree of difference in the way that the maps perform. And so and again, just the fact that these are 50-50 states at every level, right? They're competitive for judicial races, they're competitive for governors races, they're competitive for president, and yet they sort of produce these outsized advantages for one party or the other. That suggests that it's not something that is accidental. And that's not to say that geography and what people call sorting doesn't have an impact. Clearly you wouldn't expect in any of these states that the maps would be 50-50, despite the fact these are 50-50 states. Democrats do tend to cluster in the big urban centers. So, you wouldn't necessarily expect North Carolina, for example, to be, 7-6, but, you don't also expect it to be 10-3.
Right. So what is happening to produce these maps?
Well, so gerrymandering is something that we've long had a problem with in our country. The term dates to the early 1800s, and a map that Governor Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts signed into law, and that's where we get the term gerrymandering, because the argument is that at the time people thought one of the districts looked like a salamander, so they called it a gerrymander, and hence we have the term gerrymandering. Now, of course, he pronounced his last name Gary, so I'm not sure why it's not gerrymandering, but that's an issue for another day. But it's something that's long existed in our country. So it even goes back before Elbridge Gerry to Patrick Henry. In fact, Patrick Henry is famous for give me liberty or give me death, but at the same time he was a politician. He was a member of the Virginia legislature at the time that they had to draw their first congressional map, and he hated a man named James Madison, and he tried to draw the map in a way that James Madison couldn't win election to Congress. Now, he was unsuccessful, but even the framers engaged in political manipulation of maps. What has changed in recent years, and why it's getting worse, is frankly two things. One is sort of data and technology, and the fact that we have become a more polarized society. It used to be people have long tried to do these sort of extreme gerrymanders where they get an extra large share of seats and they lock it in, but they weren't very successful at it. This was really common in the 19th century, but the maps would last for maybe an election or two, and then people would move around, or their allegiances would shift, or they would have drawn the districts in a way that really didn't enable them to stick. Now we have data about voters that we didn't have in the past, and so we know things at the block level about how likely it is that every individual voter in the precinct or block is going to vote. It used to be in the old days that you would know that a precinct voted 50% Republican and 50% Democrat, but you wouldn't know where the Democrats and Republicans were unless you had on the ground knowledge about where they were. But now, because of things based on your Google searches, based on what kind of car you drive, based on your credit score, based on what you buy on Amazon, we have a lot more data about people. And in the same way that political campaigns and marketers use that data to create profiles of people and have a good sense of who you are, gerrymanderers also are able to use that. And so they're able to know like how likely it is that you are a Democrat or a Republican, how strong a Democrat or Republican you are. Likewise, how likely it is you are to vote in presidential years and midterm years, and how likely you are to switch, and what your issues are, whether you're a voter who cares a lot about abortion rights or a voter who cares a lot about the owning as many guns as you can. And there's lots of information that we have now, and that makes it possible for people to slice and dice at sort of a micro level and create districts that not only create an advantage for a party, but also stick in the sense that no districts sort of change on the map. And so that's like completely anathema to what the framers would have wanted, because they thought that the House should be and legislatures should be places where as the mood of the people changed, the composition of the legislature would change, and that we would always have a house where it was an exact miniature, a portrait of the people as a whole, to use a phrase that John Adams used. And that's not the case now. In fact, the House is in a lot of ways more predictable in your average year than the Senate is. So there's more competition in the Senate than there is in the House, because the House is so designed to lock in exactly what you have.
Right. So the political check is gone, right? Right.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this idea of these biases being very durable. Can you talk a little bit more about what you found, for example, going into the midterm elections of 2018, how gerrymandered maps might prevent any changes from happening despite, so-called blue wave or very different results in voting?
Yeah, so we did a follow-up report to our Extreme Maps report called Extreme Gerrymandering, the 2018 midterm, in which we tried to gauge how much of a structural barrier Democrats have to being able to win a majority in the U.S. House in 2018, and we found that it was really pretty significant. Democrats would have to win the national popular vote by something north of 10% to be favored in a normal year to win the House. Now, 2018, of course, in many ways is not a normal year. It's a year where there seems to be extraordinary enthusiasm on the Democratic side. And likewise, Democratic candidates are doing well in fundraising. Democrats are getting all the people they want to run. And there's a lot of volunteering, and as you've seen in the special elections, really high turnout among Democrats. And so 2018 may be sort of an exceptional year, and Democrats could win potentially a majority with less than a 10 plus point win, but that's only 1 year, right? And so if 2020 proves to be a more normal year, even a pretty good Democratic year, but a more normal good Democratic year, then those gerrymanders could snap back with a vengeance, and Democrats could end up losing a lot of seats that they might win in 2018 because it's an extraordinary year. And so that really is the lesson of it, more than anything else, is that these gerrymanders, they may not hold for an election, but they will hold for the majority of the decade, and that is truly undermining our democracy.
Yeah, I saw a spot that you posted on your website featuring Alexis Farmer, one of your research and program associates.
It's from Michigan, yeah.
That's right. And can you, where she was talking about how this plays out in, I think it was 2 states, North Carolina and Maryland, for example. And so we've been talking a lot about Republican gerrymanders, but can you just walk us through the example of Maryland and how the gerrymandered maps there will kind of lock in bias for elections to come?
Sure. There's no question, and this is important to get out. I mean, I've talked a lot about how Republicans have an advantage, and that's really because in 2010 there was a wave election. Republicans won a huge number of seats, 63 in total, and took control of the House, and they won a bunch of seats they weren't normally expected to win, and that really were sort of, surprise wins. But what happened is that redistricting took place the next year in 2011, and so Republicans were able to lock in an advantage because they controlled redistricting in more states than Democrats. And so, which is not to say that Democrats, given the opportunity, wouldn't do the same thing. Democrats historically have been equally aggressive gerrymanderers, and in this decade, in a state like Maryland, they also were very aggressive. Maryland is a very Democratic state. It has 8 congressional districts. Historically, 6 of those were Democratic and 2 were Republican. In part because they didn't control many states, Democrats decided we're going to maximize our potential and take 7 out of the 8 congressional seats, and only leave 1 for Republicans. In fact, they actually toyed around with trying to take all 8 of them, but they thought that would stretch them a little too thin. A fair map in Maryland probably is something closer to 5-3. It's a very Democratic state, but it's not sort of a 7-1 state. 5-3 is probably more natural. 5-3 also would probably allow election of more people of color and more people who represent and are the choice of communities of color. But what Democrats did is they took a district in the western part of Maryland and swapped out about half the voters, took half the voters out and put them in other districts and moved in another equivalent to half the population of the district from elsewhere. And so what they did is they took out more rural areas that were Republican voting, and they put in suburbs of Washington D.C., which are very affluent, and created a safe Democratic district, and it's sort of really a strange district in a lot of ways because the areas that they added in the Washington D.C. area are among the most affluent in the country. I think the median income is well north of it's like like 190,000 or 200,000. It's just like very high, and the areas they left in, are places where the median income is more like, 50,000, right? And it's sort of like, these are like very divergent places that have very little in common, and it was done solely to maximize Democratic advantage and to give Democrats an extra seat, recognizing, as National Democrats did in 2011, that they, in places like Texas and Michigan and Pennsylvania, they weren't going to have a lot of ability to maximize seats because they didn't control the process.
Thanks, Michael. In our next segment, we're going to talk about things that that are being done to challenge these kinds of practices. But just to wrap up this segment, seeing what you've seen and having really analyzed the maps that exist right now from the 2010 cycle, what kind of changeover or turnover are you expecting from the 2018 elections?
Well, that's a really interesting question because it tells you a lot about how these gerrymanders get done, because when you gerrymander to try to grab a large share of seats, sort of an extra large seat bonus, what you don't do is you don't draw districts that your party wins by 80%, because if you do that, you're using your voters very inefficiently. Instead, rather than drawing 80% districts, what you want to do is you want to spread your voters out as much as possible so that they win, so that your party wins as many seats as possible. And so you're drawing a bunch of 53, 47 districts, even 52, 48 districts if you can get away with it. And you try to do it so artfully, again, knowing a lot about the voters who are in the districts, and so that they hold, right? That it may look competitive at 52-48, but it really isn't, because you so carefully pick the voters that it never flips. The danger, of course, in doing that is you build a wall to protect for a 100-year or even a 200-year flood, but you're not protecting against a 500-year or 1,000-year flood. And 2018 could be, sort of the electoral equivalent of a 500-year or 1,000-year flood. And if that happens, then the water rushes over the dikes and the dams, and you end up losing a bunch of seats. So that is something I think that a lot of people are wondering if that's going to happen in a lot of states, just because, again, you drew these districts and they might be like perfectly safe in a normal year, but 2018 isn't going to be a normal year. Having said that, the lesson is that these gerrymanders can pop back the next cycle, because Democrats, really, to hold on to whatever gains they have in 2018, would need another 2018 equivalent year in 2020 to hold on to that. And it's that may happen. It certainly could happen, but it may not. And if that happens, then you would expect Democrats to lose a bunch of seats. That's exactly what ordinarily would have happened to Republicans in 2012. And in 2010, they won 63 seats, including some really unexpected pickups that you normally would expect there to be some adjustment in 2012, which is a more pro-Democratic year. That the only reason that didn't happen is because in 2011 you had gerrymander, you had redistricting and a lot of gerrymandering that went on, that's the lesson. But redistricting this time doesn't take place until 2021, and so there's the Democrats could end up losing whatever they pick up in 2018.
Interesting. So, as a scholar in this area, what states are you going to be looking to see, whether there is going to be kind of these effects, from gerrymandered maps? What states are you focused on?
So we look at two sets of states. One is, we look at these battleground states that seem like they should be really sort of very robustly competitive at the congressional level, but haven't been thus far. So, states like Michigan, Ohio, North Carolina are prime among the states that we look at. Also, Texas. Um, Pennsylvania we used to look at a lot, but Pennsylvania's map was redrawn by court order, and it has a much fairer map. The other states that we look at would include Pennsylvania now for with its new map, but also states like California where the map was drawn by a redistricting commission. And what we found in is that when you have maps that are drawn by courts or maps that are drawn by commissions, is that they're much more responsive electorally. As a party wins more votes, it wins more seats, and that's true for Democrats, it's true for Republicans, and that's really sort of what you would think that democracy should look like, right? If you get together with people who share your political beliefs and you organize, you may not be able to win every single district. There are places, I live in Brooklyn, New York, where in a state assembly district that Barack Obama won by 98% and that Hillary Clinton won by 96%, and where Donald Trump was actually the third place finisher behind Jill Stein. So you're not going to have a competitive district in central Brooklyn, right? But if I'm a Democrat, I should be able to look at a map in New York and say, get together with my other Democrats and say, well, gosh, where could we win a seat in the Hudson Valley or, on Long Island or wherever? And likewise, Republicans should be able to say, okay, we're not going to win these seats in New York City, but where can we win a seat, in say, in, upstate New York or something like that we don't currently hold. And so that's the whole purpose, right? As legally, the idea is that you get together with other like-minded people and you sort of form an association and you try to go out and win elections. And what happens because of gerrymandering is that association is rendered effectively useless, and the election results are locked in. And so in places like California and Minnesota and places where you've had court drawn maps, California had a commission drawn map. That vision of people winning more seats as they win more votes is preserved, and that's not been the case in Michigan. It's not been the case in Ohio. It's not been the case in North Carolina. So we're going to watch those states to see whether the gerrymanders collapse. But we also want to look at sort of how responsive the better maps are in places where you had a fairer map drawing process.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michael. We'll follow along and see how it plays out.